Spacing is a buzzword that, if you've been around the Souls PvP community for long enough, has become overused to the point of losing all meaning. Despite this, the concept that it describes is one of the building blocks for getting good at Elden Ring PVP, and by extension, Souls PvP as a whole. So in this video, I'm going to be defining spacing as a universal tool that is useful for players of all skill levels. To do this, I want to step into the shoes of a new player and explore how they might have discovered spacing on their own. Then, with this practical view of spacing in our minds, I'll expand those ideas into a wider picture, exploring how spacing can be applied to every interaction in the game. And finally, we will implement the element of time, bridging the gap between theory and practical application. Previously only allowing us to analyze snapshots in time, this section will show how a thorough understanding of spacing can allow you to predict your opponent's attacks well into the future and strategize about optimal game plans. So how does a new player discover spacing on their own? It would be common sense to say that when your opponent swings at you, your first response should be to roll. Even PvE teaches this well. So a new player may start out dodging every time their opponent swings, indiscriminately. This playstyle can be described by some if-then statements. If the opponent swings, then you roll. If the opponent is open, then swing at them. If anything else, they have no clue. One of the fastest adjustments a new player can make to this is to learn the length of their own weapon. I don't think PvE teaches this that well, but it doesn't take that long to learn in PvP. Once they have that down, the strategy can further develop. Your opponent naturally dodges every time you swing at them, so you start looking for times that they cannot dodge. Just as in PvE, right after someone has swung their weapon, they're open for an attack. This strategy can be simply described as you wait right outside the range of your opponent's weapon and wait for them to swing so you can get a counterattack. This starts a natural progression of learning, where the new player eventually learns the range of every move in the game. And unlike learning how long your own weapon is, this is going to take a considerable amount of time. If this sounds like too much to ask, don't worry about it. This is an ongoing process that can take the backseat to learning other skills. All you need to do is pay attention and remember the ranges as you learn them from the fights. And I consider this skill as impossible to fully master. You can only improve it. Another strategy, and one that may not come so naturally, is strafing. New players often find this on accident, and then implement it into their game plans later. Nearly every attack in the game can be strafed under certain correct circumstances, but that does not mean that you should attempt to do so. This is one where you have much more freedom to experiment. Find the moves that are easy to strafe and abuse that fact. As time goes on, if you are looking out for it, you will eventually find what works best for your skill level. And if, in the future, you are looking to elevate your gameplay at any point, it may be necessary to revisit the skill with a finer tooth comb. What I'm going to do now is visualize what we have developed so far into the game as a set of concentric rings around the player. To simplify this visual, it will be represented by vertical lines in front of the player. Just remember that they extend 360 degrees. Each line represents the range of an attack. R1s, R2s, running attacks, jumping attacks, etc. The longest attacks tend to be the running or jumping attacks, and the shortest tend to be the rolling or standing R1s. The rest are generally in between. For example, I've done this for Claymore just to demonstrate how this can be done for every weapon in the game. And when we think about strafing, we can represent that on our diagram as that move no longer existing for so long as you're strafing properly. The same thing for jumping. From here, we can break this interaction down even further by looking at single attacks. For example, take the R1 and think about all the ways in which you can punish your opponent for whiffing it. Then think about which moves in your arsenal will produce the greatest reward for landing them. Your weapon choice determines what is optimal, but usually the standing R1s produce the best results. From a certain distance, far enough away from your opponent, a rogue R1 will go unpunished, of course. And at some point closer to the opponent, your running R1s and R2s will usually start to punish their R1. But only just barely, and you'll have to take a few steps forward first before pressing attack. A few steps closer still, your running R1s and R2s will start to hit without needing to move forward first. And they're a step closer, and it starts to become possible to punish their R1s with your own R1s, but only after you take a step forward first. Again, a little farther forward and your R1 will punish without needing to move forward first. What we have done here is map out your optimal punish for a whiffed R1, given your distance from your opponent. However, there are two more distances that we need to define. These distances are the closest you can be to your opponent while running or walking away from them, such that if they swing, you will be outside the R1 range before the attack lands. Note, this is inside the range of the R1, and this fact becomes very important when strategizing about how to trick your opponent into swinging. Adding this to our map of distances reveals an important pattern. It shows us that the closer you are to your opponent, the more likely it is for a punish to land, and said punish will be more damaging. To generalize this, we will split the distances into 5 distinct ranges. The first range is true neutral. No matter what my opponent does, no matter what move that they swing, it will always whiff, but I will probably never get a punish either. The next range in is burst range. You are inside or right on the edge of getting hit by their longest move, but that is the only move that they can hit you with. Closer still is what I'm going to call neutral. This is where you are outside of R1 range, but close enough to get the punish on an R1, but you'll still get hit by their burst options. Running R1s, running R2s, jumping attacks, etc. This is one of the common ranges that you'll spend a lot of time because you can actually get punishes by being in this range. Closer still is an area of ambiguous neutral, where the question is always raised whether if they swing an R1 right now, will it hit me? And the answer is often never known. This space is often used to trick your opponent into swinging, and then you'll be someplace farther away by the time their R1 comes out. And finally, the closest range that you can play in is unambiguously within the range of their R1 and your R1. You often play in this range to pressure for roll catches and or do some mix-ups, but generally it's not safe. As a quick aside, this can also be thought of defensively. There are some ranges in which an R1 will never roll catch because you're too far away when you start a roll, and other attacks make you double roll if you're not at max range. For example, the Curved Greatsword in the offhand, if you start right next to them, you're going to have to double roll. What this does is create a mental map of all the outcomes to every interaction in the game using distance as the only input. Meaning, if you know the distance between you and your opponent, then you will automatically know the best responses to whatever option they choose to do. I may have lied in the previous section a little bit. Distance may not be the only thing you need to consider to play optimally. What we were working with before were snapshots of the game in time. With this, we were able to make optimal decisions given the details of a situation, but this did not tell us anything about how to optimize spacing as part of a game plan. So how does adding time bridge the gap between the binary nature of our previous theory, I am out of the range of the attack, yes or no, to a framework that can be used to understand and predict gameplay well into the future? Here's the thought process to do just that. Your game sense makes a prediction. For example, I predict that my opponent will do a running attack next. Spacing sets a goal. I know how far away from my opponent I am now, and I know how far away I need to be to get the punish. Time then asks the question, how fast can I get there? Or more pertinently, do I have enough time to get there? Understanding this is key to the application of spacing. Finally, your mind assesses and reacts. Just because you predicted your opponent will do a certain move does not mean that they're going to do that. But that is the beauty of this skill. You don't attempt to punish. You don't swing if your opponent doesn't do what you thought they would. It is completely non-committal to move to a space to punish a move on prediction, and for that prediction to be wrong. You don't give up anything doing so. But doing this, making predictions and moving to the optimal distance to punish, adds an inherent insidiousness to your movement. Eventually, one of your predictions is going to be correct, and you will get the punish. In the opponent's eyes, it looks like you're reading their mind, and it feels like it's impossible to do anything without getting punished for it. While this is not true, it applies a lot of pressure to them. What may become apparent when trying to implement this is that the complexity inherent in determining if you have enough time to get to this distance you want, your goal distance, is really high. To aid in learning this, I'm going to offer some essential tricks to simplify the approach. Tip 1. If you and your opponent are doing the same actions, then you will neither gain distance nor lose distance from one another. Here are some scenarios from most applicable to least applicable. Both players are standing still. This is obvious, but if you are already at the correct distance and your opponent does not move, then you do not need to either. The next scenario is both players are running in the same direction. This is useful when you think your opponent is going to run at you after coming out of an animation. Line up the distance before they come out, and as you run straight back and they run forward, the distance remains constant. This is super useful when trying to punish players who do running attacks out of everything. The next scenario is both players are walking in the same direction. In many ways, this is the same as running, but either players can choose to start running at any given time, changing the distance. I will point out here that the rate of change in distance between a running versus walking, a walking versus standing still, and a running versus standing still character remains constant if you are moving along the same line. It becomes much more complicated if you're moving in 2 dimensions, but you may want that. Less applicable is when you and your opponent both jump in the same direction. Not because it doesn't happen, it's just very rare. And finally, both players, if they swing the exact same weapon in the exact same direction, they will remain at constant distance. This is very, very situational and only really applies to mirror matches, but this does bring up tip 2, the fact that every action in the game moves a character by a set amount of distance in the direction that they are facing. And maybe even more important than that is the fact that every animation, or at least most of them, all take the exact same amount of time to complete. When I say everything, I really do mean everything. This can be applied to every interaction that contains an action that has a set animation. But let us take a common scenario and break it down. You swing at your opponent and they roll away from it. You know how far away they were before they rolled. You then know how far away they were after the roll because all rolls are the exact same distance. You also know when they will be able to perform their next action because all rolls are the exact same length. You can also predict that it's most likely going to be a rolling attack based off of game sense. You know the length of said rolling attack, and so you move to the goal distance for that attack because you want to be able to punish it. If they swing, you get a punish. If they don't swing, you don't need to swing, and you move on to the next game plan. If they do something completely different, you may need to react accordingly. Many animations can give you enough time to determine the distance between you and your opponent. On certain scales, movement in this game is unreactable, especially if the difference between being in versus out of range is a single step. So we use repeatable animations like pivots, rolls, R1s, etc. to evaluate the true distance between you and your opponent and to adjust necessarily. Oftentimes, at the ends of these animations is the only times we truly know the locations of both characters simultaneously. This brings us to our third and final tip. You should memorize situations that occur a lot so you can muscle memory the correct response without needing to go through this whole line of thinking during the match. I'm going to call these set pieces, and if you pull nothing else from this video, you should at least remember set pieces. Remember how in the timing section of the video I told you, ask if you had enough time to get to the goal distance. This is how. You memorize interactions. This works because in the meta, the same interactions are going to happen over and over and over again, with there only being small differences between them, and that is namely the variation in starting distance, which can vary functionally infinitely. What many good players do is repeat these set pieces every time the situation comes up. The only determination that they have to make is to interpret the starting distance. Some set pieces are really sensitive to the starting distance and won't work if you're off by a little bit, and some aren't. What we have done here is loop back around to finding what spacing really is in practice. It is an extension of your game sense. I have taken that nebulous concept and applied explicit language to it, generating a framework that can be used to understand, analyze, and help improve your gameplay. It links spacing back to the core principles of the game. This shows us how improving your knowledge of weapon length and frame data can have a ripple down effect on your higher level skills. To recap, when learning spacing, you learn the length of your own attacks first. Then you learn the length of your opponent's attacks. Then you learn from what distance you can punish those attacks at. And altogether, these core skills set your goal distance. From there, you can add the dimension of time to determine if you have enough time to get to this goal distance for the punish. This takes an understanding of recovery frames for nearly every action in the game. None of these have to be done in the exact same order so long as you revisit the previous skill often to hone your understanding of them. And finally, all this will come naturally as you improve, so don't worry about all this sounding daunting. What I laid out were stretch goals and not the minimum requirements. Ultimately, you could have come to be good at spacing without understanding anything that I laid out in this video. It just would have taken a lot longer. Hopefully this video helped at least someone understand spacing just that much more, and take care.